I never thought locking my own gate would turn into a neighborhood drama, but here we are. My street is one of those pristine HOA neighborhoods where every lawn blade seems monitored by a hidden camera. The kind of place where the grass grows at exactly 2.5 inches, the mailboxes are perfectly aligned, and if your Halloween decorations are a day late, you might as well move out. It's a beautiful street, don't get me wrong, but peace comes at a price. The price of being constantly watched. That evening, I had finished my usual yard work and decided to lock the gate at the back of my property. Nothing fancy, nothing unusual. Just me making sure my yard was secure before heading inside. I had done it 1,000 times before, but this time, the universe decided to turn a simple action into a full-blown crisis. As I reached for the lock, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. A kid, probably no older than 12, was peeking from behind the fence of the neighbor's house. I assumed he was curious or maybe just wandering, but then I noticed the little device in his hand. A phone, and not just any phone, he was speaking into it. Suddenly, I felt my stomach drop. This was no casual chat, this was serious business. I tried to ignore it and focus on my lock, but the suspense was building. What could he possibly be calling about? Was he reporting something dangerous? Me? The gate? The cat? My imagination started running wild. In this neighborhood, a misplaced garden gnome could spark outrage, so the possibilities were endless. I finished locking the gate and stepped back, trying to act casual. Probably just calling his mom, I muttered under my breath. But then I heard the faint whirring sound of engines in the distance. Sirens, lights. My heart skipped a beat. There was no way could it really be happening. Were they coming for me? Over a gate. Minutes later, I saw the flashing lights approaching, blue and red streaks cutting through the evening calm. My neighbors peeked from behind their curtains, whispering and pointing. I felt like a character in a suspense movie, except the plot made no sense. All I did was lock my gate. How could this escalate so fast? I stepped onto my porch and waved to signal I was okay, hopping to calm whatever chaos was about to unfold. But of course, nothing could prepare me for what was coming. As the first police car pulled up, the tension in the air was palpable. I could almost hear the collective gasp of my neighbors. It was that kind of suspense where you can feel time slowing down, like everyone is holding their breath, waiting for the next dramatic twist. My mind raced. What would they say? Would they ask for my ID? Accuse me of trespassing on my own property? Could this really be happening over a simple gate lock? The absurdity of it all made me want to laugh, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins kept my voice tight. I told myself to stay calm, explain myself clearly, and hope for some common sense to prevail. But common sense has a funny way of disappearing when an overzealous neighbor and her son are involved. I didn't yet know that the kid had called 911, framing my completely legal action as some sort of emergency. I also didn't know that Karen, the neighbor I had occasionally clashed with over lawn decorations, had been tipped off immediately. She was already on her way, probably clutching her binder of rules and grievances, ready to escalate. I glanced around at the quiet street. Normally it was serene, almost idyllic. Tonight it felt like a battlefield. Every tree, every mailbox, every hedge seemed to be watching. The suspense was tangible. The kind you feel when you know something ridiculous is about to unfold, but you can't stop it. As the police car stopped in front of my house, I took a deep breath. I had locked my gate, a completely normal action, yet here I was, standing in the middle of my yard, about to explain myself to officers who probably assumed the worst. The neighbors were whispering, the lights were flashing, and somewhere in the distance, Karen's son was probably bragging to anyone who would listen that he had saved the neighborhood. I knew one thing for sure. This was not going to be a quick, calm interaction. No, this was about to turn into a full-blown suburban soap opera, complete with dramatic entrances, rule citations, and more suspense than a late-night thriller. And the worst part? I was the unwitting protagonist, caught in a storm of overreaction over a gate. And so it began, the evening that started with a simple lock and escalated into something I would tell people about for years, always with disbelief and a touch of humor. This was just the beginning. If you think the police arriving was the peak of the drama, you haven't met Karen and her son. Karen is the kind of neighbor who treats the HOA handbook like the Bible. She knows every rule, every regulation, and every minor detail of what is acceptable in the neighborhood. If someone so much as leaves a trash can out a few inches past the curb, Karen notices it. And then, naturally, she writes it down. She keeps lists, spreadsheets, and maybe even a whiteboard in her house, tracking infractions like a general planning a battle. I had crossed paths with her a few times before, mostly minor disputes over lawn decorations or paint colors, and every encounter left me feeling like I had just survived an intense boardroom meeting. Then there's her son. If Karen is the general, her son is her lieutenant. He's this hypervigilant, tattletale in training who seems to have inherited a sixth sense for spotting threats. Anything out of place, anything slightly unusual, and he's on the phone calling someone, usually 911. I have no idea how a 12-year-old knows the emergency number so well, but apparently he has memorized it like a secret weapon. The combination of Karen's obsession with rules and her son's love of drama was a recipe for disaster. And unfortunately, I was about to be the main course. Earlier that day, I had noticed her peeking through her blinds at me, probably taking notes. Her son was lurking in the yard, his phone ready in hand. I waved casually, hopping to signal peace, but in retrospect, that was a mistake. Apparently, any interaction with me is a signal of hostility in their eyes. I chuckled to myself, thinking maybe I was imagining the intensity. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but deep down, I knew better. There was always an undercurrent of tension whenever Karen was around, like walking on a tightrope over a pit of tiny, passive-aggressive complaints. The gate incident had been simple, just me locking my own property. Nothing illegal, nothing unusual. But Karen's son had already framed it in his imagination as a high-stakes emergency. By the time the police arrived, he had concocted a story of a suspicious person tampering with neighborhood security. I could see the way his eyes darted around, trying to gauge if he had created a panic. It was almost impressive how seriously he took his role as neighborhood protector, but also horrifying because it meant I was about to become the villain in a story that didn't exist. As I stood there with the police officers, I tried to stay calm. I explained myself repeatedly, "This is my gate, my property, I was just locking it for the night." The officers nodded politely, but I could tell they were skeptical. After all, how often do kids call 911 over something as mundane as a locked gate? The suspense hung in the air, thick and tangible, as neighbors peeked out of windows and whispered among themselves. It was like everyone in the neighborhood was collectively holding their breath, waiting to see how this suburban meltdown would unfold. Then Karen appeared. Of course, she did. She stepped out of her house with her binder in hand, full of meticulously documented complaints, HOA rules, and probably at least 3 different color-coded charts showing past infractions by other neighbors. Her expression was one of righteous indignation, the kind that makes you feel guilty simply for existing. She began speaking before I even had a chance to explain anything further. Her voice was sharp, precise, and full of authority, like a teacher catching a student in the act of cheating. The suspense increased tenfold. I could tell this wasn't going to be a quick misunderstanding. This was going to be a battle of wills. Her son hovered nearby, narrating every movement as if he were live streaming the event. "He's still on my property," he said, pointing vaguely, even though we both knew it was technically mine. "I'm calling 911, he shouted again, like it was a battle cry. I wanted to take a step back, maybe apologize for the accidental drama, but Karen's glare made it clear that even acknowledging her son's theatrics might be considered an offense. At that moment, I realized something important. In this neighborhood, even the smallest action can snowball into a spectacle. A locked gate, a phone call, a well-timed glare. They all become pieces in a complicated drama orchestrated by Karen and her son. I had unwittingly become a central character in a story I never auditioned for, and the plot was about to get even more ridiculous. And so I stood there, trying to stay composed, explaining my actions to the police, while Karen lectured me like I was a criminal mastermind, and her son documented every second. The suspense was unbearable. Neighbors peeked from windows, whispers filled the air, and I knew deep down that this was only the beginning of what would be one of the most absurd, chaotic, and utterly entertaining experiences of my life. Little did I know, the gate incident had set off a chain of events that would escalate far beyond anything I could imagine. The tension, the drama, and the humor were only starting to unfold, and I was trapped right in the middle of it. The day had started like any other, with the sun setting slowly over my quiet HOA neighborhood. I had just finished tidying my yard and decided to lock my back gate. Simple, mundane, completely normal. But apparently normal was not in the vocabulary of Karen's son. I approached the gate, key in hand, and as I turned the lock, I noticed movement at the corner of my eye. There he was, Karen's son, staring at me like he had just witnessed a crime. I tried to give him a casual wave, the universal gesture of, "Hey, no worries," but he didn't wave back. Instead, he darted toward his phone, already dialing with the kind of urgency usually reserved for life-or-death emergencies. I froze for a moment, unsure what to do. Part of me wanted to laugh. This was absurd. I was locking my own gate. How could that possibly warrant a 911 call? Yet the tension was rising. My imagination ran wild. What if he told them I was breaking into my own property? What if he claimed I was a neighborhood menace? The suspense was unbearable. I could feel every neighbor's eyes on me, even though most of them were hidden behind blinds. Seconds felt like minutes as I finished locking the gate. I stepped back, trying to appear calm, hoping the kid would just hang up. But no, that was too easy. He was narrating the entire scene to the dispatcher. "He's tampering with the property. It looks suspicious. He has a key," he exclaimed, voice trembling but full of conviction. I wanted to shout, "It's my property, it's my gate." But my voice seemed small and powerless against the chaos he was unleashing. Within moments, the whirring of sirens pierced the calm evening. Blue and red lights flashed in my backyard as police cars arrived, tires crunching on the perfectly manicured street. I felt my stomach drop. Neighbors peeked from windows and front porches, whispering excitedly. It was like my private backyard had turned into the stage for a live drama, with me as the unwitting star. The first officer stepped out, hands raised in a polite but cautious greeting. I explained calmly, "This is my property, my gate, I was just locking it." He nodded, scribbling notes, but I could tell he was unsure. After all, how often do kids call 911 because someone locked a gate? The absurdity of the situation was surreal. I wanted to laugh, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins kept me tense. Every sound, every movement felt magnified. Then came Karen, appearing as if summoned by the chaos itself. She marched out of her house with her infamous binder in hand, waving it like a weapon. Her face was a mix of indignation and triumph. Behind her, her son grinned, proud of the emergency he had initiated. The suspense ratcheted higher. I realized I was now caught in a suburban battlefield, with rules, regulations, and melodrama stacked against me. The police officers tried to mediate, asking questions while I gestured to the gate and explained. "I live here, this is my property, I lock my gate every evening." Karen interjected, listing violations, possible aesthetic infractions, and even imagined threats. Her son added running commentary, pointing and shouting, "He's suspicious, look at him." The absurdity was almost comical, yet the tension was real. I felt trapped in a situation that had escalated far beyond reason. I glanced at my neighbors, peeking nervously from their windows. Some were smirking, others whispered, and a few seemed genuinely concerned. It was a mix of amusement, curiosity, and disbelief. I realized that in this neighborhood, the smallest actions could explode into full-blown drama, and I had unknowingly lit the fuse. As the officers continued questioning me, I tried to maintain my composure. I repeated calmly, "I was locking my own gate. Nothing more, nothing less." Each word felt heavier than the last, as if I was carrying the weight of an invisible jury of neighbors and a hypervigilant kid who had just learned how powerful 911 could be. The suspense lingered as everyone waited for the next move. Would the police take action against me? Would Karen file an official complaint with the HOA? Would her son call in reinforcements? The evening had turned into a tense standoff, with my gate as the center of a suburban storm. And in that moment, I realized that sometimes, living in an HOA neighborhood means even the simplest, most logical actions can spiral into chaos. A locked gate, a curious child, a watchful neighbor. They were all ingredients in a drama I never signed up for, yet here I was living it, every heartbeat magnified by suspense, and every glance weighted with humor and disbelief. The stage was set, the actors were in position, and I was trapped in the middle of one of the most ridiculous and tension-filled situations of my life. Little did I know, this was only the beginning, and the story was about to get even more chaotic when Karen decided to escalate things further. The sound of sirens grew louder, echoing through the otherwise quiet neighborhood. It was surreal. My own backyard, my peaceful evening, had transformed into a scene straight out of a suburban thriller. I had locked my gate, a completely normal legal action, but somehow it had escalated into a situation that warranted flashing lights, uniforms, and official investigation. I couldn't help but think, only in this neighborhood. As the first police car screeched to a halt, neighbors peeked out from behind curtains, their eyes wide with curiosity and, in some cases, amusement. I could almost hear their thoughts. What did he do now? The suspense was palpable. I felt like the main character in a movie where the stakes didn't make sense, yet everyone acted as if the world might end at any moment. Officers stepped out, calm but alert. They approached me with the practiced caution of people trained to handle dangerous situations. I waved my hands in a gesture of peace and explained, "I live here. This is my property. I was just locking my gate." The words felt small against the flashing lights and the weight of the neighborhood's collective attention. The first officer nodded, scribbling notes, but his eyes flicked toward Karen's son, who was clearly thrilled with the attention he had orchestrated. Karen soon followed, marching toward the scene with her binder clutched tightly. Her expression was a mix of triumph and indignation. She began reciting supposed violations, her voice sharp and precise, like she had been practicing for months. Her son narrated every detail, pointing wildly and shouting phrases like, "He's suspicious. He has a key." I tried to stay calm, but I could feel the tension tightening around me like a noose. The officers tried to mediate. "Sir, can you tell us exactly what happened?" one asked, his voice calm, professional. I explained again, "I live here, it's my property, I was locking the gate. That's it." He nodded politely but glanced around at the gathering crowd and Karen's dramatic gestures. It was clear they were trying not to roll their eyes at the absurdity of the situation. The neighbors had started gathering outside, whispering and pointing. Some were hiding behind bushes, peeking like secret spectators in a theater. Others came to the edge of their lawns, pretending to check the mail but really just watching the drama unfold. The suspense was thick, almost tangible. It wasn't just about the gate anymore. It was about pride, perception, and power. Karen's son, now emboldened, shouted details at the officers, embellishing some parts and omitting others. "He's been doing this for days. He's suspicious. Watch him." It was like watching a child direct a neighborhood play, except the consequences were real and I was the unwilling lead actor. I glanced at the police who were clearly trying to piece together fact from fiction. I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm despite my racing heart. "Look," I said, "this is my property. I've locked this gate 1,000 times. Nothing unusual is happening." The officers nodded, but Karen cut me off mid-sentence, listing more supposed infractions, from the color of my gate to how I trimmed my shrubs. The absurdity was almost comedic, yet the tension in the air kept me on edge. For a few moments, everything felt like it was on pause. Neighbors, officers, Karen, her son, and I, all frozen in a tableau of suburban chaos. The suspense was unbearable. I could feel every heartbeat, every glance, every whisper magnified. I realized that in this neighborhood, the smallest actions could spiral into a full-blown spectacle. Finally, one of the officers stepped closer and said, "Sir, we just need to confirm you live here and that this gate belongs to you." I handed over my id, explained once more, and tried to inject some humor to lighten the tension. "I promise I'm not breaking into my own house," I said. They gave a small, polite chuckle, but Karen's glare was enough to remind me that humor was dangerous territory in this scenario. Even as the police worked to sort things out, I could see the suspense building for everyone around us. Neighbors whispered, children peeked from behind curtains, and Karen scribbled furiously in her binder, as if recording the event for posterity. Her son was practically vibrating with excitement, thrilled at his own role in escalating the situation. I realized something important in that moment. The gate wasn't the problem. The rules weren't the problem. The problem was drama. Pure, unfiltered suburban drama, and somehow I had become the central character. The lights, the officers, the whispers, the tension, it was all part of a story that had spun out of control, and there was no quick resolution in sight. As the first officer finally confirmed the situation and prepared to speak to Karen, I took a deep breath and tried to steady myself. The suspense wasn't over, not by a long shot. In fact, it felt like it was just beginning. Little did I know, the confrontation with Karen and her son would escalate even further, taking this ridiculous, chaotic story to new heights. Just when I thought the worst of the chaos was over, Karen decided to take things to the next level. Apparently, the police visit wasn't enough. No, now she had to involve the HOA. I had underestimated her dedication to rules, spreadsheets, and dramatic flair. She stormed off to her house, presumably to draft a formal complaint, and I could feel the tension in the neighborhood spike. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains and doors, whispering excitedly, as if they were spectators at a championship drama tournament. Her son, still energized from the 911 call, ran around, narrating everything to anyone who would listen. "He locked the gate again. Watch him," he shouted. I wanted to laugh, but the adrenaline and embarrassment kept me from it. The suspense was unbearable. How could a simple action like locking a gate turn into this level of chaos? Yet here I was, the protagonist in a suburban soap opera, and Karen and her son were the antagonists. Within minutes, my email started blowing up. The HOA had received a complaint from Karen, of course. The subject line read something like, "Possible threat to neighborhood safety, urgent review required." I stared at my screen in disbelief. She had written paragraphs about my gate, my alleged suspicious behavior, and even included hypothetical scenarios of what could have happened if the situation escalated. The absurdity was staggering. This was not just overreaction. It was artistry in suburban paranoia. Neighbors started talking. Some sided with Karen, whispering about rules and order, while others gave me sympathetic glances, clearly thinking I had been unfairly targeted. The suspense was building. I knew that at any moment, an official letter, another complaint, or even another 911 call could land on my doorstep. The tension wasn't just in my backyard anymore. It had spread throughout the neighborhood like wildfire. I tried to make light of it, telling myself that humor was the only way to survive this madness. I muttered under my breath, "Next time I'll just put up a moat and a drawbridge. Clearly, gates are too controversial." But the absurdity of the situation didn't diminish the stress. Every time I glanced at my locked gate, it felt like a ticking time bomb, waiting for Karen or her son to turn the smallest action into a full-blown scandal. The police had left, confirming that there was no illegal activity and that I was simply exercising my rights on my property. But that didn't stop Karen from escalating the situation within the HOA. She started sending emails detailing my supposed infractions, citing rules that seemed to exist only in her imagination. The suspense kept me on edge. Would the HOA side with her? Would I be forced to appear before a board meeting defending my right to lock a gate? Every notification ping on my phone sent a jolt of anxiety through me. As I paced in my yard, I realized something important. The real drama wasn't about the gate. It wasn't even about me. It was about control, pride, and perception. Karen wanted to assert authority, her son wanted to feel powerful, and the neighborhood wanted a spectacle. I was merely the unwilling centerpiece, caught in the middle of a story I didn't write. The suspense was addictive, though. I couldn't look away. Even as ridiculous as it was, I was now living the kind of suburban adventure most people only hear about in gossip. Throughout the day, neighbors continued to whisper. Some offered advice like, "Be careful, Karen doesn't play fair," while others just wanted to watch the show unfold. It felt like being in a theater, except the script kept changing and I was improvising every line. I tried to stay calm, but the tension was relentless. Each small movement, every glance felt magnified. It was a test of patience, nerves, and humor. Eventually, Karen returned, clearly preparing for her next act. Her binder now contained updates, new evidence, and probably a detailed plan for further escalation. Her son followed, narrating every step like a commentator at a sports game. The suspense was reaching a fever pitch. I knew that the confrontation, when it came, would be intense, dramatic, and possibly hilarious in hindsight. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. This was no longer a simple gate-locking incident. It was a full-blown suburban saga. The stage was set, the characters were in place, and I was trapped in the middle. Every word, every gesture, every glance carried weight. The drama was far from over, and I knew the next chapter, the confrontation itself, would be the climax of this absurd and chaotic story. Little did I know, things were about to get even more intense when Karen decided to confront me directly, bringing all her energy, paperwork, and overreaction to my front yard. The suspense, tension, and humor were about to collide in a way that would make this one of the most ridiculous experiences of my life. It happened faster than I expected. One moment, I was packing in my yard, trying to calm my racing thoughts and remind myself that it was just a gate, and the next, Karen appeared at the end of my driveway, binder in hand, eyes blazing with determination. Behind her, her son bounced on the balls of his feet, narrating every movement like a live commentator at a sporting event. The suspense in the air was so thick, I could almost feel it pressing against my chest. "I can't believe this is happening," I muttered under my breath, though there was no time for self-pity. This was the showdown, the moment where reason and absurdity collided. Karen marched toward me with the kind of intensity reserved for courtroom dramas. I tried to greet her calmly, hoping for a civil conversation, but it was clear that politeness had no place here. "Sir," she began, waving her binder like a shield and a weapon at the same time, "I have documented evidence that your behavior is threatening and violates multiple HOA rules." Her son chimed in. "He's still suspicious. Look at him. He locked the gate again." I swallowed hard, realizing that the simplest actions of mine had been transformed into acts of high crime in their minds. The police had left earlier, but their presence had only delayed this inevitable confrontation. Now, standing in my own driveway, I felt like a character in a sitcom with an uncomfortably high level of suspense. Every neighbor who peered through curtains or over fences became an unintended audience, and the tension of being watched made my heart pound faster. I took a deep breath, trying to inject humor into the situation to diffuse it. "Look, it's just a gate," I said, holding up my hands in a gesture of peace. "I live here. I lock it every night. Nothing suspicious about that." Karen's eyes narrowed, clearly unimpressed. She wasn't here for logic or calm explanations. She was here to assert authority, and nothing I said could stop her. Her son continued to narrate, embellishing the story as he went. "He's packing, he's sweating, he might be planning something." I wanted to laugh, but it felt dangerous. In this neighborhood, humor at Karen's expense might count as a violation. Instead, I focused on staying calm, letting the suspense build without adding fuel to the fire. Karen started flipping through her binder, pointing to highlighted passages, charts, and apparently meticulously recorded incidents from previous days. "According to the HOA regulations," she said, her voice sharp and precise, "you're creating a potential hazard for the neighborhood." I blinked, trying to process how locking my own gate could possibly be a hazard. Her son nodded vigorously, adding dramatic commentary at every pause. The tension was unbearable. Neighbors were now watching from every angle, whispering and pointing. It felt like the entire street had become a theater, and I was the unwilling lead in a production I never auditioned for. Every heartbeat, every glance, every small movement carried exaggerated importance in this bizarre suburban drama. I tried to reason calmly. "This is my property. I lock my gate. That's it. There's no hazard, no threat, nothing illegal happening here." Karen was unrelenting. She waved her binder like a magic wand, each page a symbol of authority, each word a tiny sword aimed at me. Her son interjected, dramatizing my gestures as if I were a villain plotting something sinister. The suspense escalated with every second. Would Karen file an official complaint? Would her son call 911 again? Would the neighbors take sides? It felt like walking a tightrope over a pit of absurdity, with each step demanding perfect balance between diplomacy, humor, and self-preservation. Finally, I realized that the confrontation had reached its peak. The suspense had turned into full-blown chaos, and the humor of the situation mingled with the drama in a way that made me shake my head. Karen and her son were convinced they were enforcing justice. I was convinced that I had just survived a suburban battlefield. As the standoff continued, I took a deep breath and mentally prepared myself for the next steps, surviving the inevitable aftermath, dealing with the HOA, and figuring out how to reclaim my own backyard from the hands of overzealous neighbors. The confrontation was intense, absurd, and completely surreal, but it was only one chapter in this ongoing saga. Little did I know, the tension was far from over. After this face-to-face showdown, Karen would escalate things further, sending letters, filing complaints, and making sure that my simple act of locking a gate became the talk of the neighborhood. The suspense, drama, and humor were about to collide even more spectacularly in the next part of this suburban saga. After what felt like hours of standoff, the chaos began to slowly unwind. The police, thankfully, had already confirmed that I was doing nothing illegal. My gate was on my property, and I had every right to lock it. Still, Karen's intensity had left a lingering tension in the air, one that didn't dissipate immediately. Neighbors lingered outside, whispering and exchanging knowing glances, as if a major event had just concluded in our quiet little street. The suspense was still thick, but at least the immediate danger, if you could even call it that, was gone. Karen retreated to her house, clutching her binder like a trophy. Her son, visibly deflated after the standoff, sulked behind her, muttering dramatic complaints about how the neighborhood wasn't safe. I felt a strange mixture of relief and amusement. The situation was absurd, and yet it had consumed my evening and probably everyone else's in the neighborhood. I shook my head and muttered under my breath, all over a gate. Emails and messages started rolling in from the HOA. Apparently, Karen had already submitted a formal complaint, outlining in excruciating detail how my actions had allegedly disturbed the peace and posed a potential threat. I read through it, part horrified, part laughing. She had included bullet points, sub-bullets, and even hypothetical scenarios, imagining what might have happened if the gate had been locked differently or at a slightly earlier time. The suspense of reading it made me feel like I was opening the script of a dark comedy. Neighbors continued to whisper, some siding with me and some subtly nodding toward Karen. It was as if everyone had taken positions in a suburban war that only existed because one kid had seen a gate being locked. Every glance, every conversation, every passing car contributed to a subtle, lingering tension. It was exhausting, but also strangely entertaining. I couldn't help but think, this will be a story I tell for years. I finally had a moment to breathe. I walked to my gate, touched the lock, and let out a sigh. Nothing had changed. The gate was still mine, the property still belonged to me, but the psychological battlefield had shifted. I realized that surviving the confrontation had been a combination of patience, humor, and knowing my rights. The suspense of waiting for the next move was still there, but it was manageable now. A few days later, the HOA sent a letter acknowledging Karen's complaint, but ultimately confirming that no action would be taken against me. They noted that I was within my rights and that my gate was on my property. I felt a wave of relief, but the absurdity of the situation lingered. Here was a neighborhood where the slightest act could spiral into chaos, and yet somehow, common sense had prevailed. I couldn't resist sharing the story with a few trusted neighbors. Their reactions were a mix of shock, laughter, and disbelief. Everyone agreed it was one of the most ridiculous things they had ever seen in our community. Suspense had turned into humor, and the tension slowly melted into shared amusement. It was one of those moments where reality is stranger than fiction, and you can't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. Looking back, I realized that the drama had a silver lining. I had learned a lot about the neighborhood, about my rights, and about the sheer power of overreaction. Humor had been my survival tool, patience my shield, and a calm explanation my weapon. The suspense had carried me through the confrontation, making every moment feel intense, but now it had transformed into a story worth telling. Karen, of course, didn't disappear entirely. She continued her minor complaints, subtle passive-aggressive remarks, and her son continued his vigilant observations. But the major crisis, the one triggered by a simple locked gate, was resolved. The tension eased, replaced by a cautious truce. The neighbors returned to their routines, and life slowly went back to the unusual calm that defines a HOA neighborhood. As I sat on my porch that evening, reflecting on the chaos, I laughed quietly to myself. What started as a mundane action had turned into an epic suburban saga. The suspense, drama, and humor had been intertwined perfectly, creating an experience that was exhausting, ridiculous, and unforgettable all at once. I locked my gate again that night more cautiously, but also with a new appreciation for the strange theater of my neighborhood. Little did I know, the final reflections and takeaways, the lessons, humor, and warnings, would become the perfect conclusion to this ridiculous story, ready for anyone who wants to survive or laugh at their own suburban adventures. The saga wasn't just about a gate. It was about patience, absurdity, and the strange power dynamics of HOA life. After days of chaos, standoff, emails, whispers, and lingering tension, I finally had a moment to step back and reflect on the absurd journey that began with a simple act: locking my own gate. The suspense, drama, and humor had carried me through the confrontation with Karen and her son, and now it was time to extract the lessons, laugh at the ridiculousness, and appreciate how truly strange suburban life can be. First, never underestimate HOA Karen and her highly dramatic offspring. This duo had turned my backyard into a battlefield, and my gate into the most dangerous piece of property in the neighborhood. Every small action, every gesture, even a casual glance at the street, could be misinterpreted and escalated into a full-blown incident. The suspense of knowing they were watching, always ready to report, added a constant tension to my daily routine. I had learned quickly that in these neighborhoods, perception often outweighs reality. Second, patience is essential. When Karen approached with her binder, waving it like a weapon, and her son narrating every move, it would have been easy to panic or lose my composure. Instead, I took deep breaths, calmly explained my side, and reminded myself that I was on my property and within my rights. The suspense in the air made every moment feel intense, but patience allowed me to navigate it successfully. Humor helped too. Sometimes, a quiet chuckle under your breath is the only thing keeping you sane. Third, humor is a survival tool. The entire situation was absurd: the kid calling 911, the police arriving over a locked gate, Karen wielding her binder like a sword, and neighbors peeking from windows like an audience at a theater. Laughing at the ridiculousness didn't diminish the tension. It made it bearable. I joked to myself about installing a moat next time, imagining drawbridges and nights patrolling my yard. Humor kept me grounded, helped me manage stress, and allowed me to look back on the events without bitterness. Fourth, document everything. Karen had her binder, charts, and notes ready at all times. I didn't have to go that far, but keeping a record of the interactions, emails, and communications proved invaluable. It not only helped clarify the situation, but also reminded me that clarity and organization can be your ally when navigating the drama of HOA life. Sometimes the most absurd conflicts can escalate without reason, and having documentation on your side is a quiet form of power. Fifth, recognize the absurdity and embrace it. The suspense, tension, and drama of this incident could have consumed me entirely if I hadn't stepped back and seen it for what it was: a suburban soap opera brought to life by a gate, a vigilant kid, and a determined neighbor. Every email, every comment, every whispered observation was part of the story, and realizing that allowed me to maintain my sanity and even find moments of humor in the chaos. Finally, share the story. The absurdity of this experience is worth telling, both to laugh and to caution others. Neighbors, friends, and family found it hard to believe that locking a gate could create such a spectacle. It reminded me that life in an HOA neighborhood is full of surprises, suspense, and characters so dramatic they could star in their own series. Recounting the story transforms stress into entertainment, tension into laughter, and frustration into perspective. As I sit now, reflecting on the events, I realize the saga wasn't just about a gate. It was about navigating human behavior, understanding the dynamics of control, and learning how humor, patience, and calm can diffuse even the most absurd conflicts. Karen and her son may continue their watchful vigilance, but I have survived, learned, and grown from the experience. My gate remains locked, my property remains mine, and I have the story to prove it. For anyone living in an HOA neighborhood, take note. Simple actions can spiral into drama, perception often outweighs reality, and patience, humor, and knowledge of your rights are your best defenses. The suspense will build, the drama may escalate, but in the end, your own common sense and calm will see you through. And as for me, I now check my gate carefully, smile at the absurdity of it all, and sometimes imagine my backyard as a stage for a dramatic play starring me, Karen, her son, and the neighborhood audience. It's exhausting, ridiculous, and completely unforgettable. That's the beauty and madness of life under the ever-watchful eye of an HOA. Locking my gate will never be the same again, but neither will my perspective on the strange, suspenseful, and oddly humorous world of suburban neighborhoods. It's a story worth telling, a lesson worth learning, and a reminder that sometimes the smallest actions can create the most dramatic adventures. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one, the truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.